Hello all! Our new book for today, Mr. Putter and Tabby Paint the Porch by Cynthia Rylant, illustrated by Arthur Howard. It was springtime, and Mr. Putter and his fine cat Tabby were feeling very chipper. The birds sang, the sun shone, the flowers bloomed. Mr. Putter and Tabby went out on the front porch with a book. "Let me read you a funny story," Mr. Putter said to Tabby. Tabby purred. She liked funny stories. She curled up beside Mr. Putter and waited, and waited, and waited. But Mr. Putter was not looking at the book. He was looking at a porch post. Said Mr. Putter. He picked up Tabby and looked more closely. He said again. Mr. Putter walked all around the porch looking and saying, Finally, he said, "Tabby, this porch needs some paint. First, I am going to paint the porch. Then I will read you a story." Tabby purred. She loved Mr. Putter's plans, especially when they included her. She followed him to the basement, swishing her tail. Happy it was spring. Chapter 2. Scat. Mr. Putter carried his painting things to the porch. He had a bucket of pink paint, a big brush, and some rags. Suddenly, one of the rags got away. Tabby chased it across the porch and caught it. "Good cat," said Mr. Putter, patting her on the head. Tabby purred. She might be old, but she could still catch a wild rag when she had to. Mr. Putter dipped his brush into the bucket and began to paint. As he panted, he began to sing. He sang about paper roses and blue bonnets and coming around mountains. Tabby purred and purred. This was even better than a story. Mr. Putter didn't yodel when he read a story. All was going well when suddenly a squirrel showed up. The squirrel jumped onto a freshly painted porch rail. "Shoo!" said Mr. Putter. The squirrel jumped onto another rail. "Scat!" said Mr. Putter. Then the squirrel ran across the floor of the porch. "Scram!" said Mr. Putter. And that's when Tabby remembered how good she was at chasing things. "Yikes!" yelled Mr. Putter. The squirrel ran and Tabby ran. And before it was all over, Mr. Putter's porch just sort of painted itself. Chapter 3. Very pink. The next day, Mr. Putter's porch was very pink. The walls were pink, the floor was pink, and even a few of the windows were pink. And Tabby was very pink. Mr. Putter's neighbor, Mrs. Teaberry, walked over with her good dog Zeke. "Oh dear," she said, looking at Mr. Putter's porch. Zeke was sniffing Tabby's pink whiskers. Mr. Putter sighed. "I have to do it all over again," he said. "Well then, we will help," she said, rolling up her sleeves. So Mr. Putter went back to the basement. Tabby followed, swishing her pink tail. Soon, Mr. Putter and Mrs. Teaberry were putting blue paint over pink. And all was going well until suddenly a chipmunk showed up. It jumped on a rail, it ran across the porch. And then Zeke remembered how good he was at chasing chipmunks. Chapter 4. A Lovely Yellow. The next day, Tabby and Zeke stayed inside Mrs. Teaberry's house while Mr. Putter painted his porch. Again, he covered up all of the pink paw prints and all of the blue paw prints and made the porch a lovely yellow. When the porch was dry, Mrs. Teaberry arrived with Tabby and Zeke. Mr. Putter was happy to have Tabby back. He brought a book out onto the porch and said that he would read a funny story to everyone. But just as Mr. Putter was about to begin, a pink squirrel and a blue chipmunk walked by. And Mr. Putter and Mrs. Teaberry laughed so hard they didn't even need a funny story. The end. Thanks for listening. Have a wonderful day.